I think it's a really important exploration, this whole agenda in terms of the policing with the black community and the impact that those relationships have on our mental health. I think it's absolutely critical. Yeah. Absolutely critical. My name is Councillor Dr. Jacqui Dyer, and I'm a local government councillor in Lambeth, and I'm also a national lead around mental health equalities, working with NHS England, the government, and Health Education England.
Community, do you think that there's still a stigma around mental health services in the black community right now?
I think this stigma is ongoing, and it's been deep within the psyche of the black communities in relation to mental health services, based on their experiences of mental health services. One of the interventions, in a sense, that I made locally was to bring together various stakeholders to create Black Thrive, which is a partnership organisation which is based on improving the outcomes for African and Caribbean communities in terms of their mental health and well-being, simply because this area is so poorly attended to, primarily in relation to mental health services, but also in relation to other parts of our social system. So when you think of all aspects of our society in terms of employment outcomes or education outcomes or housing outcomes or in the criminal justice system for example, that range, what you will find is that people of African and Caribbean heritage always have the poorest of the poorest outcomes and poorest of the poorest access or opportunities. And one can imagine that if you haven't got access to being able to flourish like your white counterparts, that you're more vulnerable to being at the edge of society, being excluded, vulnerable to all kinds of things, including mental health challenges. And then you're facing a mental health sort of set of services that treat you badly, such as, which has been an ongoing experience for black communities. So you have Olasena Lewis, Sean Rigg, Rocky Benny, the list is endless over decades of black people not getting a human, dignified and respectful, caring service from mental health services. So the stigma, what do we mean by that? In my view, stigma means distrust of mental health services based on the stories and the narratives of so many people's experiences who are black with mental health services that have not been positive. Therefore, there's a resistance and a fear of going and engaging with those services because the outcomes for you might be very poor. In fact, you might die.
In the UK, there's a lot of conversations about systematic racism, how this will affect the mental health of the black community. Would you be able to describe that?
So if you think about the different dimensions of what makes up a society in the sense of education, housing, schooling, employment, just those dimensions alone, if you are experiencing barriers to be able to progress in those areas because you are black, you have a different experience in terms of your access to housing, for example, as a black person than a white person. So in this borough, you're 13 times more likely to be homeless than your white counterparts. So that's here in Lambeth, yeah? As a black person, you're 13 times more likely to be homeless than your white counterparts. You add to that vulnerability in being homeless, no stability. You add to that an experience of maybe not being able to get employment. Then you can see that it starts, there's a kind of accumulated set of racisms, barriers that have prevented you from moving forward in those areas. There's no reason why, as a black person, you're supposed to be, you're experiencing being 13 times more likely to be homeless than your white counterparts, other than there are barriers in the housing or access to housing or access to economics that enable you to have money in your pocket to afford housing that amount to systemic racism. And that's what we mean. If you add all those barriers up, what you've got is a whole system of systemic racism. Then you look at that same sort of dynamic that happens in your interactions then with the police. So if, say like a 10-year-old black young man, and every interaction that you're having with the police, or your brother is having with the police, or your sister, or your mother, or your brother, or your uncle, or your father, is a point of tension based on the fact that you are already being suspected of something before even any evidence is there, or that stereotype of, as a black person, you are big, black, bad and dangerous, or you are a criminal, is something that's been around for hundreds of years since slavery. So that idea that actually the black person is a criminal is very well embedded both in the conscious and the unconscious as a stereotype about, so that those are the eyes through which the police often look at black people, and then those are the eyes that inform the way that they treat the black body. And that leads to, for me, a way of police relating with black people which is very dehumanizing. No dignity, no respect. And there are, of course, exceptions to that experience, but it's so frequent from you are 10 years old onwards that that's the majority experience that you as black people are experiencing in terms of that relationship with the police, that how that must traumatize the black mind, the black psyche, the black family, the black community is beyond. It's just so extreme. It's just so extreme, the level of impact that would have on somebody's mental health and well-being. And then to have that struggle to counter that. So, for example, when you look at the levels of stop and search, which are in the black community, and the impact that has on black people, not so much the stop and search in and of itself, if it is pursued according to some intelligence, something is taking place and we need to stop and search, this kind of business, like real police business, but the way in which it is conducted is so undignified, so dehumanizing, and done without impunity and accountability, that I imagine so many black boys and girls, men and women are permanently scarred and damaged by these experiences. And for some, it becomes such a torment of this level of surveillance and humiliation, that it quite literally sends our people to be really unwell. So there are different degrees of police brutality, aren't there? Because a stop and search, which is done without dignity, humanity and respect, is a very violating experience. And that for me is brutality. That is police brutality. At its worst manifestation, it leads to death. And that itself has happened on too many occasions. And on too many occasions involving people who have experience of ongoing mental health challenges, or whose first experience of a mental health challenge has brought them up front with police, and it's ended in death.
Do you think that even though like George Floyd and Eric Garner happened in the US, do you think that the mental health impact still is the same for people in the UK that might be watching that on video, on social media? Do you think that the same mental impact is the same as if it was happening on their doorstep?
I don't really understand how it could be different. I think that wherever it happens, wherever a black body is being treated inhumanely, particularly at the hands of the police in this case, that you feel it like as if it's your own. You know, when I saw Jacob and when I see George, you feel it like I feel it then, not even you, I don't know about anybody else, but I feel it like as if it's my own brother, sister, family member. It's another black body having that shared experience that we have wherever we're located within the world. Wherever we're located within the world, our experience as people of African descent is one of being treated absolutely abhorrently and of dehumanization. And that is its most evident in its relationship, in our relationship with the police, and therefore police brutality. I think that there are differences, but the similarities are so the same that how do you distinguish? You can't say, oh, the police brutality that happens in the US is worse than the police brutality that happens here. It's the same. It's the same black person's experience. So am I in the UK not a black body? Am I something else now then? It's a shared experience wherever we are located in the world, which is why the whole Black Lives Matter campaign is so important, because wherever we're located, we share that commonality of experience. We share that commonality of greatness and abundance and so many positive things, actually. But how can that even come to the fore when there's so much brutality that's taking place in relation to us? So it's like, allow us to be, you know, just stop the oppression. Why is it that black people have such a poor experience of mental health services? But also we have to look at, why is it that people from black communities in particular have such high levels of mental illness? And some of that comes through our experiences in the other components of society. For example, our relationships with the police. It also always used to really shock me when I used to work as an advocate, and I'd go to some of the mental health wards, and what you'd hear from some of our black people is about how they're under surveillance, about the police. Their psychosis often rotated around their lived experience of trauma in that relationship with the police. So it was either the police or religion, more often than not, that a lot of the distress was located around. And for me, that really has to be attended to. So one of the things that I'm doing here locally is looking at the impact of stop and search on black people's mental health. And in fact, doing a bit of a research project in relation to that, working with Black Thrive, the local authority and the council around, doing some peer community research around that so that we can see if we can find ways to improve that, and especially do that work with children and young people as peer researchers, as community researchers, both looking at what the issues are, but also coming up with some of the solutions and working collaboratively with the police in order to attend to that. We've got to sort this out. This is nonsense. And in a 21st century, you can't tell me that it's not possible to address this issue? Huh?
The amount of black mental health practitioners that are currently within the NHS services. You spoke to some black mental health practitioners that are in private, but it seems like they're going from NHS to private, and there is a disparity with the ones that are in the NHS. Why is that?
There is an ongoing issue about representation across the workforce of mental health workforce, and particularly of African Caribbean representation across the workforce in areas where you have more power. So for example, as a psychiatrist or an occupational therapist or a psychologist or clinical psychologist, there is not the representation of black people at all the different levels of those professions, those disciplines, that reflect the level of need in terms of people coming from African Caribbean into the service. So there's a massive disparity there. I think there's also, and we're doing some work around that. Health Education England is utterly committed because they recruit and train the workforce across all the disciplines. So I'm working with them at the moment, and we're really committed on improving that representation. So that work is currently taking place, both looking at the numbers and actually looking at the content of the curriculum to see whether or not in each of these disciplines or these each of these disciplines, these professions, the mental health workforce, whether or not they understand the complexity of people's different experiences, particularly from a racialized perspective. So working towards being more anti-racist, basically, is the work that we're conducting at the moment. So around equity, inclusion, and anti-racism approach is what we're driving forward now. There's the other element, which is about retention in the workforce of people that come from a black experience, because the system is so endemically racist in how it operates according to all these stereotypes and how it even treats its workforce, right? That people want to run out of the NHS, especially in mental health, right, as black people, because it's so oppressive. So if it's oppressive like that for the staff team, imagine what it's like for the patients. So wherever you look, right, you're dealing with systemic racism, be that in the higher levels of disciplinaries that you experience as a black body, the high levels of harassment, the high levels of bullying, the high levels of oppression, racism, no access to opportunities to advance in your career, etc., etc., etc. So people don't want to stay in it. They want to stay there, but they don't want to stay there because 24/7 you're dealing with relentless racism, essentially, And how good is that for your own mental health? You know, I know many people that worked as black people in mental health services who they themselves have ended up in mental health services. The pressure's so great, or you end up really ill, you know? And when you finish your 9 to 5, which is often 9 to 10 or 8 to 10 compared to your white counterparts that might go home at 9 to 5, because you're the ones that are left at the doing beyond the hour kind of like thing, because actually a lot of our people are in the front line, and this is what's been exposed by COVID. So actually the bulk of NHS staff that come from black, Asian and minority ethnic communities are the ones that are doing the face-to-face hardcore frontline work. They don't get access to going anywhere further up the ladder. Actually they're in, which might mean that they're in management and making decisions, which means that they don't, not necessarily in that face-to-face work, which is where a lot of the emotional burnout comes from. But at the same time, you're experiencing that and working with people who are really in crisis, and at the same time, you're experiencing bullying, harassment, and extra disciplinaries, and all kind of relentless racism. I mean, come on. Why would you want to stay there? But actually, for some people, you have to stay there because financially, where else is there to go? You're black. The system doesn't support your progress. It's an exception that we get through, not the majority. You know?
Do you know if there is any NHS staff that are supporting family members of people who have died in police custody? So, i.e. Sean Riggs' sister Marcy said she had no support after what happened to her. Do you know why that is? Are the police working with the mental health services in order to create some kind of support for these families, or do you know anything like that?
No, you see, for me, that's something that is a gap. But that's a gap that, in a way, would be catered for if we had services that were appropriate for the black experience, because within that you would have services that would be able to respond to family members and a family that is impacted by police brutality that's led to death. So it's because we don't design services that respond to our experience that those services are absent. So therefore Marcia gets no support. I mean, it's outrageous, you know, but it's like a denial of that experience. So if you have that service, or if you have a service that's able to respond to that experience, that means you have to own that that experience takes place. So if no services respond to that, then really that experience is not happening. So you can sweep it under the carpet.
And is it because of the lack of funding why people from the mental health services are not being called when someone is having a crisis, rather than police being called to detain them, and then they end up in the services that way?
There's supposed to be a sort of joint role, actually, between the police supporting mental health services rather than the police. Police are not mental health experts, so they're not the ones that are supposed to take the lead on mental health intervention to support somebody who's in crisis, basically. That's supposed to be mental health services with support from the police. So for example, if they're under the Mental Health Act and somebody is at risk of harm to themselves or others, then you might need the police to support with detaining somebody in that circumstance, yeah? So there are, so the law sort of helps to facilitate that. So I think that there's a blur around that relationship between the police and mental health services, and that balance sometimes is wrong, actually. And that's where you see things like what happened with Olaseni Lewis or Sean Rigg, for example, because there wasn't the working together of the police, the mental health services, and all other professional services involved in that person's care, working together effectively, which means that the onus is not on one particular part of the support network. Actually, the leadership is supposed to be provided via the mental health services.
A lot of the time, police officers get called out for people that are in mental health crisis, and he was saying that that should be a role of the mental health services that are dealing with their patients, essentially.
But they're getting called out by who? A lot of time they're getting called out by I don't know.
Yeah.
They're called out by, you see, one of the challenges, problems that exist is that as community members, black community members, when a family member or is in crisis, actually, with a mental health challenge, or a community member is in crisis or whatever, people don't know where to go. So actually the first point of call that people call is the police, right? Because people don't know where to go for help. They don't even really know what's happening, but they're actually feeling sort of frightened or they don't know how to deal with somebody who is really quite vulnerable and kicking off. You know, so where do you go for help? And some of that is about that people might be aware of mental health services, but they're not fit for purpose. So you don't want to reach to them because that person might die. So they go to the police because they don't feel like they've got the options. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to make sure that via the Mental Health Act review that there's advocacy, culturally appropriate advocacy, and culturally appropriate peer support. That actually, when crisis or difficulties or challenges happen within your community, right, you will know where to go for help, and that help will be mediated by parties that have your best interests all the way at heart and support you in your interactions with mental health services, in your interactions with the police. And this bit of the puzzle is absent, and that's the bit that we've got to make more present. So, for example, a friend of a friend was visiting a friend. That friend, the police came round with mental health services to take the person out of the house because they were breaking down in terms of their mental illness. And there's a law that enables you to do that, and if the social workers or whoever have applied for that piece of law, got a warrant, they can go to that house and take that person out. Luckily, my friend was there, and the anger and the frustration and not really understanding what was taking place was able to be alleviated somewhat between the police and the person, because my friend was able to help navigate that. So that's like an advocate, a peer support that draws out the whole tension out of that experience, so that then there's a better outcome that happens for that person, for that black person. And that black person was grateful to my friend, and the police were grateful to my friend, because they say there's never anybody around to help in those really difficult situations where it's quite inflamed and hot, because you've got the police with all their power coming and employing their power with a very vulnerable person who now is angry with the police coming to take them out of their space. Do you see what I'm saying? So there's some things that are missing that need to be part of the fabric of how we do things. And some of that is about empowering more of our community members to actually know some of how the system and the processes work, and actually being involved in helping to support our brothers and sisters and neighbours as they're going through these difficulties and challenges. And that's even more profound now, post-COVID and post-Floyd. We need to be more empowered. Wherever there are racialised experiences, needs to make sure and show evidence that they are having providing access to culturally appropriate advocacy and peer support. And I think for me, I'm even more adamant that that must happen, because I've just lost my second sibling on the 1st of June this year, and he died after 35 years of being in the mental health care system. And my younger brother died at age 41 after being 20 odd years in the mental health care system. So for me, the whole thing has been flawed. It hasn't worked, and actually I can see mechanisms that would help it to work. And I don't want for any other family member, brother, sister, anybody to experience the pain and torture that I actually experienced from knowing that the system failed two of my siblings. I had 3 brothers, I've only got 1 left now. And that for me is a system that's failed. And so for me, the timescales in relation to this are urgent. They're not 2 years time and 3 year times and all this kind of rubbish. It's like now. And in fact, why haven't you done it already? You know, it's actually negligence. How can you say that you are mental health services that are fit for purpose if any member of your services are not getting what they need? And if you don't understand that when you're black, you are less likely to get what you need. My brother, when he goes and sees, when he went and see, I remember one time being in a CPA meeting with a consultant psychiatrist when I was younger, and that consultant psychiatrist said to him, "Oh, Barry, we don't understand your culture, do we? So we can't talk about that. But let's talk about your medication and see if we can get that right." So my brother, I couldn't even speak at the time. I was so shocked. I was like, my brother was reduced to medication. It's no longer okay. It's not okay. It's just not okay. So for me, the timescales are really quite urgent.
Sorry to hear that, Jacqui.
Sorry.
It's all right. I'm really so sorry. I want to hug you if not.
My younger brother was 41, and this one that's just gone Barry is 53 years old. My mum's 80, she's outlived 2 of her children. By that, it's just, our family, our life has just been pure trauma. Do you know what I mean? I ain't here to play, this is no play thing. This isn't some little career that just because I've enjoyed a sort of career that I pick up off shelf and gone to college to study about. This is about real life. This is about dealing with serious trauma and serious pain in a way that actually helps people to heal. What else is it supposed to be there about? So it's funny that you were talking about clinical psychology, for example, because I just had a meeting today about the very same thing, about how are we going to get people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities properly recruited into clinical psychology, right? And how are we going to retain it? And how are we going to improve the curriculum in this regard? I'm working on it, I'm telling you, right? So, and that work takes quite a lot of energy because you have to work across all the big wigs and then the big wigs underneath there and then all those people that are so resistant in a sense to the change because they're holding on to their bastions of power. But actually at this particular moment in time, you can no longer do that. You are exposed as, especially in psychology, How can you be doing a psychology that doesn't understand the black experience and respond to that? And you haven't got people there to deal with that, and you're all there sitting like that, talking about like that. I mean, it's fraudulent. It's actually fraudulent. And so they're starting to have to really examine their own selves and examine their white privilege and all these kind of like dimensions. So I have to have a series of all these kind of like meetings and negotiations to move it forward. And I've sort of had to learn how to do that, to navigate the system and navigate it to get to take traction, and it takes time. So now, sort of like tilling the soil, now I can move it. And it's really difficult as well, because it's quite difficult to explain to our communities that are actually feeling it at the sharp end that you have to do all that kind of work in order to get it to move what are actually quite Titanics. Do you know what I mean? It's not like you can just go like, and then all of a sudden it's like, it's all hunky-dory. Because, for example, if you look at school exclusions, for example, another component that we're dealing with in terms of Black Thrive. So remember, it's like looking at the whole, right across the whole system. So one of the things that when you look at people with mental health issues, right, as black men, for example, the vast majority of them are being excluded from school, yeah? So if you go back all the way to like school exclusions, and then you have to look at, okay, so what is it that means that a black child is getting excluded as opposed to the white child? Okay, so what are the processes that are in place that make that exclusion really easy for that teacher or that school to do? So then you have to break that down, and then you remove the process or the step that makes it easier and put in something that makes it fairer. Do you see what I'm saying? So you have to it's like it's like breaking everything down to its smallest denominators and then start putting it together again, where you get rid of the things that mean that bias and racism can flourish. Do you see what I'm saying? And that's just in relation to school exclusions, or one child in one school. And then you look at that, because different schools have different processes. So you have to look at that across all schools. Then you have to look at that according to primary school, secondary school, further education. Do you see what I'm saying? The whole thing is made up of layers and layers and layers that you have to break down in order to put it together again, in order to help transform our experience. There's that, plus there's making additional effort and using equalities legislation to mean that actually so for example, clinical psychology, some of the eligibility criteria for getting onto a clinical psychology course is that you've done some voluntary work in some sort of therapeutic arena. Actually, black people can't afford to do voluntary work. We don't have no income. So actually we're trying to just survive. So you've already got that financial barrier that then prioritizes white middle class women into clinical psychology. That's one barrier. So you have to look at, okay, then how can we either remove that as a criteria or find other criteria or adjust that criteria so that it's more inclusive or equitable, or how might we maybe provide some kind of finance for somebody from black, Asian and minority ethnic communities to get experience so that then they could get that. That would be one of the things on their eligibility criteria. There's another one which is around A-levels, for example, must have whatever kind of like A-levels. Our pupils, we already know that when unless you get to exams, that black people end up being marked down in their assessments, kind of like thing. And that marking down in their assessments when you're black already might put you off, and then you say, you know what, I'm not going any further in education, for example. There's so many hurdles. And you have to break it down and address all the hurdles, is what I'm saying. There's so many hurdles, and this is what we mean by systemic racism. It's like, it's deeply embedded in absolutely everything that we do. Every single thing. It's 24/7 in every policy, in every procedure, in every department, in every office, in every part of the public sector. So in order to help to improve our experience, it's that enormity of work that needs to be done. Do you understand? So, but when you're somebody that's at the front line feeling the stress of it all, you're not going to be thinking about all that. You're just thinking, I want my experience to be a better one immediately, not knowing that all of that bit there kind of like needs to get sorted. So for me, there's how do you put in things which are a bit more immediate to help in the meantime of sorting out the Titanics? Do you see what I'm saying? So there's the immediate, which is like the advocacy and the peer support. There's the medium term and there's the longer term. And it's very exhausting, but it's like, I just don't want what's happened in my journey, in my family, to be the experience of so many other families. I just can't bear that pain. And I think that my experience means that I've got to fulfill this purpose. Otherwise, I might as well what? So I feel like I'm on purpose in this regard, in the same way as you're on purpose from your experience making this documentary. You get me?
Yeah.